Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, Senior Vice President, and with me is Tim Anaya, Senior Director of Communications.
Hi, Ro. Happy belated Labor Day.
I know. Well, I've been on vacation for the week, but I came back just to tape this opening podcast. And, I have to tell you, I have to thank you for suggesting that I sign up for the state's ballot tracker. I never got a ballot for the recall. Sort of makes me think that foul play was at hand and my ballot was in one of those, the 300 ballots found in that car, a fellow in Torrance. In any case, I emailed, as you suggested, Vote LA. And what do you know? I got an email reply within 24 hours saying that a new ballot is in the mail. Of course, I haven't gotten it yet, but I couldn't believe it that I actually got an efficient response from government. It actually works. Of course, it remains to be seen if I ever get my ballot.
Well, you may have found the unicorn.
There's some new polls that you showed me this morning from PPIC.
Yes, there's been kind of a lot of chatter this week of, where do things stand? And I think kind of anecdotally, there's been evidence that Democrats may finally be kind of waking up and getting engaged in the recall election. There's a great email that Paul Mitchell, who's kind of the political data guru of California, puts out every day, and it tracks the returns of absentee ballots. And it has shown since the first one that came out that Democrats are returning absentee ballots at a big clip, even ahead of their voter registration in the state, which is massive, as you can imagine. Now, it's a snapshot in time, but it shows that, Democrats are voting. Well, the latest evidence of that is the PPIC poll that came out late last week, and it shows the recall failing by a nearly 20-point margin. Now, I don't know if the margin is that bad, but it certainly shows that Democrats are waking up, Democrats are voting, and that the proponents of the recall have a real uphill battle over the next, week and a half or so until election day. The second question, which doesn't really matter unless the first question wins, shows kind of what all the polls have shown. Larry Elder is ahead with about 25% of the vote. Roughly the same number say that they either are going to not vote for anybody on the second question, which is what the Newsom campaign wants folks to do, and an equivalent number are undecided. And then you see down the pack at like 5% or below, you see the Kevin Faulconer and John Cox and Kevin Kiley. So, it seems pretty clear that, barring something wild, Larry Elder is in a pretty good position to come in first in that second question, but it's all for naught if the recall loses by one vote, let alone 20%.
Well, I was listening last night to a podcast called Post-Coronavirus, which is hosted by Dan Senor, and his guest was Mike Murphy, who our listeners know, was the architect of Arnold Schwarzenegger's recall campaign. And it was interesting. He thought it was less than 1 in 3, 1 in 4 chance that a Republican would win, due mostly to what we've discussed here before, that, Republicans are outnumbered 2 to 1 in the state. And now it looks like the decline to states, according to Murphy, is that's what we call independents out here, that they are now leaning Newsom. And I guess I knew this, but it was interesting to have someone like Mike Murphy say it was that Californians are low, he called them low awareness voters. And what's really important to Californians is big name recognition. Arnold Schwarzenegger obviously had huge name recognition, one of the most famous actors in the world. And so that's how he was able to beat Gray Davis, cross party lines. Don't think any of the Republicans will be able to do it this time.
That's exactly right. The point on independence, it's a common myth that independents mean moderates. Well, more commonly, independents are kind of, more to the left and more to the right. They just don't want to be a member of the Republican or Democratic parties for whatever reason.
Well, I am, our listeners are looking forward to the Labor Day weekend, and I hope they're getting out and about despite coronavirus. I was doing my favorite thing last week, which is to go wine tasting, and I went to my usual favorites, Sojourn, and I also went to another favorite, Cayman, and, the prices have gone up for wine. You're doing the same thing, Tim.
Yes, I went on Saturday. I went to my favorite winery, which is Hellwig, a winery in the Amador wine region. I had a great day wine tasting. And because my birthday is coming up, actually the day of the recall is my birthday, I got an extra coupon to spend. So I bought even more wine than the large amounts I usually buy when I go out there. And it's a fun place to go and sit out on a beautiful weekend, a great place to go and not only wine taste, but have a nice lunch afterwards.
Well, a couple of commercials here. We want to invite all of our listeners to our gala October 2nd, Saturday in San Francisco at the Ritz-Carlton. Our keynote speaker is Mark Levin, and listeners also get a free copy of Mark Levin's book, American Marxism, which is a New York Times bestseller. So, and if you identify yourself as a next round listener, we'll be sure to set you up in a great table hosted by our very own Tim Anaya, right, Tim?
That's right. You can meet us in person.
That's right.
Isn't that worth the price of admission alone?
It's also the 30th anniversary of our president and CEO, Sally Pipes, and she's been at the helm of PRI for 30 years. So, of course, we would love to see you there. You can buy tickets at PRI's website, pacificresearch.org. So this podcast features Corey DeAngelis. He's a real rising star in the school choice movement. He's the executive director of the Educational Freedom Institute, a director of research for the American Federation of Children. He's also a fellow with Cato and the Reason Foundation. So he's interviewed here by our own rising star, Evan Harris. He's director of our Young Leaders Circle. Evan interviewed him a little earlier this summer. They discuss all things school choice, especially important now because we're back to school. We have the mask controversy in the state schools. So I think this will be very interesting and very timely. Thanks so much for listening. And here's Evan and Corey.
Everybody, thanks for joining us for another great episode of Pacific Research Institute's Young Leaders Circle. Great guest today. We're going to talk a lot about school choice, education, the boogeyman that is unions, whether it's state or national. We have a great guest today, Corey DeAngelis. Corey's the National Director of Research for the American Federation for Children. Corey, thanks for being here.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
If folks don't know you, I can quickly spitball through. You've been on Fox a lot. You've been on Kennedy, Gutfield, Neil Cavuto. You're doing a lot of conferences. You're talking about school choice. Before we get into all your great work and over this past year with COVID, I kind of want to talk about how did you get here? Was next to being, a fireman or an astronaut, you wanted to be a school choice advocate, or what got you to this point?
Yeah, I'll say my first experience with school choice was in high school. So I attended government-run schools all through K through 12, but for high school, I had access to something called a magnet school. It's still run by the district, but you're not residentially assigned to magnet schools. It's a very loose form of school choice that's still government-run. And that school was on the same campus, same physical location as the school that I was residentially assigned to. And so I feel like that experience had a huge positive impact on my life trajectory relative to the school that I was supposed to attend. So I would like more families to have alternative educational options as well. And it shouldn't just be limited to magnet schools. We should be able to access charter schools, private schools. The money should follow the child to the house, to your home, if you want to pursue home-based education. And in fact, I've actually started talking about it in terms of funding students as opposed to systems, or funding students directly. Because when you say school choice, a lot of people don't really even know what the heck you're talking about. But when we talk about funding students directly, that's exactly the policy that I'm advocating for, which is having the education funding follow the child to wherever they're getting an education, which could be public, private, charter, homeschool, whatever. And then after that, I did my bachelor's and master's at the University of Texas at San Antonio in economics, which really opened my mind to the reality that the main problem with K-12 education are these residentially assigned geographic monopolies that lead to very little incentives for the residentially assigned option to do a good job. Just imagine if you're residentially assigned to your neighborhood grocery store and you couldn't go anywhere else unless you got up and moved to another house. That would be absolutely ridiculous. It would be highly costly to do so. And that establishment wouldn't have any particularly strong incentive to cater to your needs.
Yeah.
So that started to kind of click a little bit for me more in college, especially under my advisor, John Merrifield, who was a big school choice researcher. He recently retired from the university. And he advised me to go to the University of Arkansas, where I just did my PhD in education policy, where I really started to delve into the specifics of these policies and their effects on things like criminal activity and mental health of the students. And so that was kind of my background. And then I went into the Cato Institute, Reason Foundation. Okay. Now I'm at the American Federation for Children.
And I feel like if there's one phrase that I kept seeing by your name, mainly last year, it was every state that would pass a school choice bill, or as you said, it was funding students, not systems. I remember I just kept seeing that, and I'd seen some of your work before, and I'm like, this guy just keeps saying this phrase, like, what's going on here? Like what? But it was great to see, and you could kind of follow this path during COVID of legislatures more open to school choice, or realizing, hey, we're in COVID, schools are shut down. We need to have other alternatives for students to learn online, whether it's online charters or doing stuff outside the classroom. And you could kind of see, just follow this chart through the year. And then other states didn't do that, unfortunately. But
yeah, and I will say one of the reasons that's beneficial for us to talk about it in terms of funding students directly, as opposed to saying school choice, is the clarity that I talked about earlier. There's less questions, fewer questions flying around about what we actually mean. But then two, it puts the other side on defense. When you argue for funding students as opposed to systems, if you're going to argue against that, all of a sudden the burden of proof is on you to try to argue your way through a position where you'd rather fund the buildings than fund the students. And it puts them on defense, which is really good for our side strategically to talk about it that way. And then also you can bring in analogies with other taxpayer funded initiatives that fund people and even students, as opposed to systems that the other side typically agrees with and supports. For example, with higher education, we have Pell Grants for low-income students, the GI Bill for veterans. And with those programs, the money goes to the student, and then they can choose public or private, religious or non-religious universities that work best for them. Same thing with pre-K programs. The funding goes to the student, or the family at least, and the family can choose a public or private, religious or non-religious provider of pre-K services. It's only when it comes to K through 12 education where the other side gets all up in arms about people having a choice. And the only difference there is one of power dynamics, that when it comes to higher education and pre-K, choice is the norm. But for the in-between years of K through 12 education, choice threatens an entrenched special interest that profits from getting people's education dollars regardless of their choice. So they fight really hard to keep it that way. So reframing the discussion this way, I think, has a lot of benefits. And you pointed out over the past year, it's been especially relevant. And I think a reason for that is that, COVID didn't break the public school system. It was already broken. And the past year simply shined a spotlight on the main problem with K through 12 education in America, which happens to be a massive, long existing power imbalance between the public school monopoly and individual families. It's one thing for these schools to continue getting your money regardless of your choice and your satisfaction. But it's another conversation altogether for those same institutions to get your children's education dollars, regardless of whether they even open their doors for business. And so people saw the private schools opening. They saw the public schools opening for daycare, but not for learning. They saw that there's this huge disconnect between the two sectors and different responses to the pandemic. And families found out that the system isn't there for them. It doesn't really care about them. And the teachers unions overplayed their hand and showed their true colors. And so families are supporting school choice or funding students directly more than ever. And at least a dozen states this year have already signed expansions into law. So we're calling it in the movement the year of school choice.
Yeah, I mean, you said it, and my question was, I think it seemed like 2020 exposed what was going on with public schools. It exposed the disconnect. I think it's almost too easy of a example to go to, but San Francisco, instead of figuring out how to bring kids back to school, they renamed a bunch of schools, which I guess personally I think made no sense.
Priorities.
Exactly.
And actually educate the kids. We got to focus on the real important things.
But I mean, those are good points of, hopefully those are few and far between, but I think, and you brought this up, of 2020 exposed what public schools, I was going to say were doing, but really weren't doing. And I think it also shows we're having this problem in California where charter schools are still growing rapidly. Charter schools, there's wait lists, there's lotteries to get in, because the charter schools around us in Sacramento, Bay Area, they were able to pivot so quickly. They were able to pivot to online learning. They were able to pivot to Zoom easier than what it seemed like public schools, they couldn't even figure it out at first. And it's a bizarre disconnect of, you can bring in your free market, your capitalist example, but it's charter schools, I think in California, they've just been growing quickly because of that type of speed that they can adapt to students.
Well, right when the schools, right when all the school closures started in March 2020, you had families flocking to something called virtual charter schools because the virtual charter schools have been set up. They've been doing the virtual thing successfully for years. So families rightfully started to figure out that, well, the public schools, the traditional schools don't have any systems in place for this yet. We might as well go to these schools that have been doing it for years. And you had states like Oregon and Pennsylvania where the unions were lobbying against allowing families to switch to those schools, whereas any other year would have been fine. California did something similar. I don't remember the bill number, but it actually passed, and families were technically allowed to switch to charter schools, but they could not, the funding would not follow the child as it would in previous years. So it was the monopoly seeking to protect itself at the expense of families at the worst time possible. Another example from California was Sacramento area Catholic school. I'm sure you've probably heard of this one, where the school closure rules were extremely arbitrary in Sacramento County last year, whereas the daycares were allowed to reopen, but schools weren't. So a Sacramento Catholic school actually retrained its employees as daycare workers and rebranded itself as a daycare to get around those arbitrary school closure rules that applied to schools, but not daycares.
Do you know which one it was?
It was a Catholic school in Sacramento. If you just Google Catholic school Sacramento,
I'm curious. My wife went. I know all the schools around here, so it's not ringing a bell. So the bill you're talking about was Senate Bill 820. So that was how they capped it either by admission you had earlier in the year or a funding amount. But basically, you had students going to these charter schools, and there'd be hundreds more. Yet the funding stayed where they were for the previous year, which, makes no sense.
They had kids that were already admitted to the schools, hundreds of kids in just certain schools that had to put the kids back on the wait list that were already admitted because of the ridiculous law that was a bill that was passed to protect the establishment at the expense of families. And California is one of the worst states when it came to reopening the schools, even in places like San Francisco and Los Angeles. When the schools actually did start to say they were reopening, they were doing the whole Zoom in the room thing where the kids were going back to the classrooms, but the teachers weren't going back. But other adults were. The private sector daycare employees were going into the buildings, which begs the question, if it's safe enough for the daycare employees from the private sector to come into the same school buildings with the same kids, why isn't it safe enough for the public sector employees? And the reality is this was never really about safety. It was always about politics and power dynamics more than it was about real safety concerns and the needs of families. And the difference there is, look, the public sector employees get your money regardless of the amount of work they put in, whether they show up in person. The private sector employees have a different set of incentives. And so I like to point out over and over again, I don't think that the people in one sector are inherently better than the other sector or are more competent or anything like that. It's just they have a weird, messed up set of incentives that's baked into the public school system where they get your money regardless. So I blame the system, not the employees in the system.
And shame on me for not knowing it was Capital Christian that did that. And I have a family member who actually teaches there.
Were you looking it up while I was talking, fact checking me on the fly?
I was, and I'm like, well, no, I'm like, gosh, I thought that's what it was, but I couldn't remember. Yeah, I remember she actually told us that they did that, and they kind of just reclassified. But you're right, and I think we've seen it. I kind of want to jump ahead. We're coming out of COVID. I brought up to you before we started. We're in Northern California. The state is officially open today, whatever that means. What's kind of next for schools? Like, some schools are doing summer school, some aren't. Some are. Newsom here reported that most of the schools will be. They've said that they'll do in-person learning in the fall. I mean, what do you think is coming next? Do you think it's going to be that easy to return back to normal for public schools?
Well, it's hard to tell. I mean, the private schools had this figured out, mind you, at the very beginning. They were fighting to reopen. Public schools are fighting to remain closed because of that difference of incentives. The public schools say that they're going to reopen, but this has been the conversation all over the past year and a half. Is they'll set a date, and then comes to the date, there's a strike or a sick out, and then they ask for more and more things. They just keep using their bargaining position to get more and more out of the taxpayer, and regardless of what the families actually want. So, there hasn't been a lot in the news about this lately because all of the schools have pretty much said, yeah, we plan to do this, we plan to do that. But I have a feeling that once the fall semester is supposed to start, there's going to be a lot of stuff happening. There's going to be some kind of mishap or goalpost shift on the side of the teachers unions.
Absolutely.
They'll say, yeah, well, we're planning on reopening, but we need this, that, and the other. And so if that doesn't happen, that's great. Maybe my prediction will be wrong, but if I've learned anything over the past year and a half is from what we've seen is they keep shifting the goalposts. And if you look at Randy Weingarten's posts on Twitter.
Your favorite person.
Yeah, she's the president of the American Federation of Teachers, the second largest teachers union in the United States. And she keeps kind of signaling how this is all about the vaccines and that it's so great that that the children are approved for the vaccine. Perhaps she will make an argument that the schools that all of the children need to be vaccinated in order for the schools to actually reopen.
Yeah.
Maybe she won't do that, but she's been tweeting about it a lot, at least priming or maybe kind of feeling the waters for how people respond to those things. There's been a lot of pushback against it, but I haven't seen that as an actual call as a prerequisite for reopening schools, but I wouldn't put it above them.
I was going to say, don't hold your breath.
Yeah.
What I'm curious, you're in the data, you're doing the research. Is there maybe one or two states that you look at that have just been exceptional in funding students, meeting students' needs over the COVID the past year?
Yeah, Florida reopened pretty much quicker than anybody else. And Florida spends about 29% less than the national average per student. So they spend less, and California spends 38% more per student than Florida. And they were pretty much the last state to get kids back in the classrooms. And there's still a lot of kids who didn't have access to in-person instruction, and particularly when you start looking at the high school level. And so it didn't seem like it was really about money, but it seemed more about power. Again, that Florida has more school choice and competition, spends less, and was able to open their schools. California, though, has much stronger teachers unions, so they were able to wield their power to keep schools closed, to secure more ransom payments from the government. I mean, look at what happened in San Francisco. For example, Governor Newsom had a incentive of $4 billion in addition to what all of the federal government was giving to all the states, which they passed about $190 billion for the U.S. from the federal government since March 2020. And California had a plan that was $4 billion in addition as an incentive for California's public schools to reopen. What San Francisco did was they did the bare minimum. It turned into a box checking exercise to where they opened the day before the deadline only for one grade for seniors to secure the funding. And so it goes to show you that top-down incentives rarely work, and there's a ton of unintended consequences that can come along with that. The better incentive is to attach the money to the child so that schools have an incentive to cater to the needs of individual families rather than to figure out ways to check a box to get money from the taxpayer. So Florida did really well, has a lot of school choice. And Florida their Governor DeSantis already signed a bill this past year to expand their already large private school choice programs. So they expanded school choice, and they already were number 1 or number 2 when it came to private school choice.
Yeah, I real quick, I want to note it feels like ancient history, but last December, Governor Newsom had proposed this plan to reopen all public schools by February of 2020. Which I almost forgot about till you were saying that, and here we are now. So shocker there. But it is. This might be too easy because I might know the answer. Is there a state that's done it the worst, or maybe a couple? With
school choice, yes. So California does not have any private school choice initiatives. They do have charter schools.
Yep.
So there are about 3 or 4 states that don't have charter school laws on the books. A couple of years ago, West Virginia was one of those states. No private school choice, no public school choice. But this year, in 2021, they just passed what's going to be the largest, most expansive private school choice education savings account program in the nation.
Okay.
And for listeners, it's kind of like a voucher program. The money that would have followed you to your public school follows you to a savings account for your child that can be directed by the family. You can use it for private school tuition and fees like a voucher, but you could also use it for home-based instruction and on instructional materials and online learning. It really takes us from school choice to education choice.
Can I ask, is there a reason in terms of, was a different governor, was it a legislative switch, or did they just decide maybe this makes sense versus what we've been doing?
Yeah, I think the past year obviously put it to the forefront of everybody's mind, what's happened over the past year with COVID. But also, I talked to one of the main senators over there, and I think she said something along the lines of elections matter. So we got to get the right people in office too to support something like this. But they passed it no problem in West Virginia. It was clear majorities, maybe even super majorities passing the education savings account program there. But they essentially went from 0 to 100 when it came to school choice this session. Other states, you're based in California. California is one of the worst when it comes to private school choice. There is talk about a 2022 ballot initiative to get school choice on the ballot, private school choice. So,
well, good luck to them.
Yeah, that's a possibility, but maybe it's it's more likely, I think, to happen on the ballot than through the legislature in California.
Absolutely.
So it's worth a try, I guess. But this past year, I talked about 12, 13 states already signing these things into law. They're mostly red states that are, and if you look at individual votes in the state legislatures, it's possible for Democrats to vote for school choice.
Okay.
And they have done it this past year in some cases. But overwhelmingly, what we've seen is with these votes, every single Democrat votes against, and you get most of the Republicans voting for the proposal. And I think the difference there is not because the constituents from the Democratic side don't support school choice. It's because the teachers' unions have outsized influence in Democratic politics, because about 99% of their campaign contributions go to the Democrats, and they're a very strong special interest group. And so even if logically speaking, it's a nonpartisan issue, and even though the majority of constituents, Republican or Democrat or independent, support school choice, you still get these weird votes that don't make sense logically or politically speaking.
I would encourage anyone to look up the Janus Decision if they'd like to learn more about that. But that could be for another time to talk about. And PRI did a project on that a while ago, but that is interesting how that's played out, or rather not played out, despite what it implied. For the folks that don't know, that was basically letting teachers opt out of unions, but it kind of disappeared in a weird way.
Yeah, I think a lot of teachers don't understand that they have the choice to opt out of the union. I mean, the Janus Decision was in 2018. Hopefully more people kind of inform the public about their options. But, at the same time, I think real accountability for unions is going to have to come from the bottom up. I mean, it helps that we got the Janus Decision on the favor of individuals and workers. But at the same time, in order for the unions to have true incentives to change the policies that they're pushing for, you need to have exit options. And the best way to do that is to fund the students directly, so you can, so that the public schools have more competitive pressures to listen to the families.
Agreed. Let's maybe shift a little bit. Maybe there's someone interested in studying what you studied, economics, school choice, somebody interested in education policy. Where would you point them, or kind of where can they go, A, to learn more, or B, to study this? What does that look like?
As far as starting a career in education policy, I mean, there's a lot of different avenues. Obviously, I took the think tank route. There's a lot of think tanks that focus on education policy, including your think tank and my think tank. So it's one way. I also, you can do a PhD in education policy like I did at the University of Arkansas. But I will say, if you're a free market type, in general, academia is not going to be very friendly to you.
Sure.
That's just the reality, especially when it comes to education programs. 99% of the people in the field, your peer reviewers, are against the things that you're studying. So it's tough to get peer reviewed when you have findings that support and theories that support school choice when your peers are against it. And especially because the peer review is double blind. Even they typically know what paper they're reviewing, because you typically release it as a working paper, then it goes to a journal, and you can pretty much figure out who you're reviewing. But the thing is, when you're getting your paper reviewed, you mostly don't, you can't tell who's reviewing your paper because it's blind, and they're not going to offer you that information. So they don't get any accountability for approving one study that has the result they like, and then not approving another study, even if it has better methods, that has a result they don't like because it's not public information, which I think would be a huge improvement to the peer review process, just to make all of that public record, to see like, well, this guy approved this study that's crappy and it aligns with his bias. But that's a whole nother conversation. So you could go into academia. I will say it's tough, but then think tanks are a way to go as well. You can also become a teacher if you'd like. I mean, that's also an option on the table as well. I think, it's important to have great people in the system, but I've typically focused on changing the system itself.
Yeah. Let's zoom out real quick. Biden in office. We're seeing a lot of policies come in, more on the progressive side. Where do you think we're headed under the Biden administration? Whether that's less school choice, more school choice. I would say unions entrenching power. I don't know how much more power they need to entrench, but do you have any 8-ball looking glass?
Well, the unions have already gotten their stinking payouts, their ransom payments over the past couple of years, $190 billion. And I will say the latest American Rescue Plan, that third stimulus, with the bulk of the K-12 education funding, $123 billion of it, there was an amendment in the Senate to make that funding contingent upon actually reopening your schools for in-person instruction, given let's say all the teachers were vaccinated. Sure. It didn't pass on a 50-50 vote in the Senate. All Democrats opposed it. All Republicans supported it, but a 50-50 doesn't get you what you need. And so they couldn't even make that funding contingent upon actually reopening the schools. So we all know they're going to use it to just put more people into the system, which gets you more power for the union and more union dues from having more people in the system. Biden hasn't done a lot when it comes to school choice, but he's not very friendly to school choice. I mean, on the campaign trail, I think Trump should have highlighted Biden's silence on school choice, because it's politically a winner for Democrats to not say anything about school choice, because whether they say yes or no to school choice, they're going to get pushback from a segment of their constituents. If they come out for school choice, the unions are going to blast them. If they come out against school choice, there's a lot of their constituents who like to use charter schools and other programs that would otherwise vote for them. And those parents may say, well, wait, I don't want to lose this great education for my child, so I'm going to have to vote against this Democratic politician. Sure. So they typically, what Biden has done has not said much about it. But I will say Biden did vote against the DC voucher program when he was a senator in 1997, which shows a track record of him being against private school choice. I think in the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force plan that came together, they were talking about defunding the DC voucher program, and also I think they took a stance against tax credit scholarships. And then a little more recently, his campaign national policy director, I believe her name was Steph Feldman, was in a conversation with the Education Writers Association in an interview where they asked her, views on charter schools. Sure. And they were she was hinting that they were going to defund charter schools at the federal level. Okay. And the way that they were going to do that was to take away federal funding from charter schools that don't provide results. Gotcha. Which they didn't really define what that meant. But when asked later in the conversation about what about the government schools that don't provide results, they said, oh, well, those ones are just failing because they don't have enough money. They just need more money if they're failing. But if charter schools are doing a bad job, we got to take their money away. I mean, so it really kind of showed you within the same interview how they view two sectors. If this one that already gets more money is failing, it just needs more money. Charter schools which already get less money than traditional schools, if they're failing, they get even less. So, and then they also said something along the lines of, if they don't have a democratically elected school board, which typically isn't the case for charter schools, they were going to pull federal funding from those types, which that pretty much tells me that they're calling to, but we haven't seen much action. It's mostly just been that kind of those hints. And then Secretary Cardona, he's not a Betsy DeVos, he's not a super staunch supporter of school choice, but at the same time, I haven't seen much evidence of him railing against school choice either. So hasn't been a lot of action, and that's kind of great. But look, education policy and most of education funding is at the state and local level. Yeah. And we're winning at the state and local level when it comes to expanding school choice. 92% of K-12 education funding in previous years, we'll have to recount after all this stimulus funding, came from the K-12, from the state and local level. So we're going to continue expanding school choice where it matters the most, regardless of how hostile the current administration is.
No, that's a great take, and I think people get wrapped up. They think it's either all federal, and don't understand, like many things actually, don't understand state and local impact, and think, oh, it's Congress, and a lot of it is county supervisors, school board, or any mayors and all of that. So, well, I think we are great on time. I'd like to leave last word with you, and also if you're working on any projects, tell us where folks can find you, read about you, and we'll be sure to share that when we get this live when folks are watching it.
Yeah, follow me on Twitter. It's at DeAngelis Corey, my last name and then my first name. And then the website for the American Federation for Children is federationforchildren.org. And last word, I'll just say, look, the teachers unions overplayed their hand over the past year, and they've done more to advance school choice than anyone could have ever imagined. I mean, if you look at the latest Real Clear Opinion Research polling on this, you'll see that over the past year, support for funding students directly has jumped by 7 percentage points. And bigger jumps were recorded for people who previously wouldn't have ever supported school choice in the past. So families are waking up to the reality that there's no good reason to fund closed institutions when you can fund students directly instead. So for that, I will say thank you, teachers unions, for inadvertently doing more to advance school choice than I ever will.
Great. Well, thanks for being here, Corey. We really appreciate it. It was great chatting with you.
Thanks for having me.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.